Hello everyone, and welcome to our session, What is Backup as a Service and When Does It Make Sense? Here at Predatar Control. My name is Krista Maycomber. I'm a senior analyst with Evaluator Group, and I cover data protection and multi-cloud data management technologies. Now, these markets have been interesting to cover, especially recently, because we're seeing that enterprises are reevaluating their data protection strategies in ways that they haven't in years. And one of the big ways that we're seeing enterprises sort of take a step back and rethink things is around how they're actually consuming their backup solution. And the other big area is really looking at who is managing their backup processes on a day-to-day basis. We are seeing kind of growing interest in using sort of an as-a-service model for backup. But one of the problems is that backup as a service can, and it often does mean different things depending on who you're talking to. We see quite a bit of confusion out there in the market around what backup as a service really means at the end of the day, and really sort of what value it brings to the enterprise. So what Predatar did is Predatar actually invited me to come in today and try to cut through some of the marketing buzz around backup as a service and lay out what exactly we are seeing constitute backup as a service solution. We also are going to touch on when it makes sense for an enterprise to start incorporating backup as a service into their data protection strategies, and also what some of the key kind of things to look for might be in a backup as a service offering. So we're going to kind of touch on those kind of really three elements over the next 20 minutes or so. And with that established, let's kind of jump in and tackle the first question, which is, what is backup as a service? So generally speaking, when vendors market themselves as having backup as a service, we typically see that there are two key types of offerings. Now, the first type of offering is essentially backup software that's hosted in the cloud. So it's delivered in a SaaS model where the backup software is hosted in the cloud, and the customer subscribes to it and procures it through the cloud as well. So one of the big kind of values or the big draws is that the customer doesn't need to worry about buying, deploying, and managing infrastructure to run the backup software. Typically speaking, they do have to manage their protection jobs, and that's actually one distinguishing element when we get to kind of the second type of service that we see. But again, there's certainly value there in not having to worry about that infrastructure to run the backup software. Another kind of component of the value that we see is that there tends to be more pricing flexibility, and it tends to allow customers to move more towards more of a consumption-based model, as opposed to more of the legacy kind of perpetual licenses that we have seen in the past. Now, the second category of backup as a service that we see is more of a fully managed and outsourced model. Now, in this model, the backup software might actually still be deployed on the customer's site. It could be deployed in a co-location data center. It could be hosted in the cloud. So there is some flexibility in terms of where it's deployed and where it's hosted. But it's, again, it can be on-prem. But what we do see is in this managed model, there can still be a shift to that more consumption-based pricing. One of the big differentiators that I alluded to a minute or two ago here is that the managed services, this kind of offloads even more responsibilities for IT when we think about things like planning, deployment, management, and really just day-to-day protection jobs. So the service provider not only is going to deploy and manage the protection infrastructure, but again, they're typically also going to manage those protection jobs to specific recovery point objectives and specific recovery time objectives that have been agreed upon with the customer. I did want to add that these services are not mutually exclusive. I actually did allude to this, that the managed model might actually incorporate some cloud hosting in there, for example, but wanted to make sure that that was called out, that there can be some overlap and these services are not necessarily mutually exclusive. So with that sort of taxonomy established, the next logical question is, okay, why backup as a service? Why might it make sense for me to kind of shift from my more traditional model and begin incorporating backup as a service into my environment? I like to kind of frame this in the context of value propositions. And I think one of the most important value propositions that can make backup as a service make sense is this concept of reduced management complexity for IT. Now, excuse me, this is particularly important today because we're seeing that backup environments are becoming more complicated than ever before. There's a larger number of sources that need to be protected. There's a more diverse range of sources that need to be protected. When we think about, SaaS apps that need to be protected, VMs, on-premises infrastructure, it's pretty complex. And that complexity sort of is compounded or heightened by the fact that these different sources are not going to have the same protection requirements. So they're going to have different protection service levels, if you will. And again, that's going to just kind of add another layer of complexity here that IT has to worry about, that if they can offload that to a service provider, then the IT team within the enterprise is a little bit more freed up to focus on some more strategic and more higher value tasks. And that's, I think certainly top of mind for, most IT professionals that we speak with today. So another kind of reason or value proposition that can make backup as a service make sense is that it allows a shift to a pricing model that is more flexible and that is more based on the resources themselves that are being protected. So in other words, it can be scaled up, it can be scaled down a little bit more fluidly to better optimize the cost structure for the protection environment. And this can be especially impactful when we think about more traditional or legacy environments that were not born on the cloud and that historically have been sort of held to some of these legacy pricing models and, excuse me, perhaps are quite inefficient from a cost perspective. So two other reasons that I want to touch on and actually really double click down into these because I think that they're pretty important today. So the first thing that I'd like to touch on is that backup as a service really can make sense today as we're working our way through COVID-19 and the global pandemic that we've all been kind of dealing with this year that obviously we'll be continuing to deal with into 2021 as well. So obviously there's been, a huge need for remote access for users, for business users and for IT alike. There's really been a need to eliminate the amount of time that IT has to actually physically go into the data center. So through backup as a service, if more kind of cloud resources can be integrated into the equation, and if some of those management responsibilities can be sort of offloaded to a third party, that there's going to be, some pretty substantial value in that as we're all trying to work remotely and work from home today. The other thing I want to touch on too is this concept of shadow IT. So I talked a little bit about SaaS applications, and we're seeing that the cloud has made it very easy for lines of business to sort of run a credit card and spin up an application, and IT is sort of then left to figure out how this new application that's generating important business data is going to be protected. Backup as a service can be a sort of an easier way and a faster way to get protection for these applications. And typically there's going to be that need, because again, it's kind of typically an afterthought here. And again, we'll touch on that in a little more detail in just a minute. So first, I did want to double click down, if you will, on COVID-19, because I think that this is a very important topic to discuss when it comes to backup as a service. So we've been kind of tracking here at Evaluator Group, we've been tracking the impact of COVID-19 this year when it comes to IT projects and priorities, number one. But number two, also sort of the day-to-day life of IT staff and the jobs that they're being asked to do in staffing levels and things like that. So we actually have a study that kind of just came out of the field that showed that, you know, certainly IT is going to be operating remotely for the foreseeable future. Only about 5% of the individuals that we surveyed for this study said that they expect to be fully in office by the end of the year. So not necessarily kind of a huge surprise there, but really underscores that need for, you know, a lower touch model when it comes to managing data center infrastructure, and that need for that remote accessibility as well. Arguably, maybe even a little bit more important is, you know, kind of the roles of IT. So number one, unfortunately, we have seen, you know, some layoffs, some furloughs of IT staff this year. Actually, about 28% of the respondents that we surveyed said that they had some level of either temporary or permanent reduction in their headcount this year. But also, we're seeing a really big focus for that remaining over 70%. We are seeing kind of a big focus on retraining, refocusing IT staff to really make sure that they're aligned with the critical and strategic business objectives. So if something like managing backup responsibilities can be offloaded to a managed service provider, then that really frees up IT to focus on those key priorities and make sure that they have that really strategic kind of day-to-day role and relationship with the business. So even more important today than ever before. Just a couple other themes that we did see in the research that I think are relevant here. So we did find that during the pandemic, you know, cybercrime has certainly increased. We've seen a very big focus on, you know, kind of making sure that the enterprise is ready to respond to these bad actors and this increased activity during the pandemic. And we've also seen, along a similar vein, a focus that, okay, now that we're all remote and we're using laptops and smartphones and VDI and different tools that we maybe didn't use as much before, there are some new security holes in our infrastructure. So those need to be, you know, kind of shored up too. And really need to make sure that our backup and our recovery is up to speed as our daily operations have changed. And again, these are kind of a couple of areas where backup as a service might be able to step in and address some of those needs. And we did actually see that, you know, customers were looking to shift a little bit more to an OpEx model. They were looking to shift a little bit more towards public cloud to be able to have some pricing flexibility and to be able to have some of the other capabilities that we've talked about in terms of get up and running more quickly, in terms of easier management, better scalability, things like that. I also wanted to double click down on kind of these SaaS applications a little bit more as well, because in my conversations, I sometimes still get asked, okay, Microsoft 365, Salesforce, G Suite, do these really need to be protected? You know, I've got my recycle bin, you know, I've got things like native redundancy built in, maybe have some sync and share capabilities. So what are the needs on top of that? And really, some of these capabilities that I called out, you know, frankly, they're not data protection at the end of the day. You know, if you have a data or a service outage, they're not going to be able to provide that recoverability that you're going to need for the data that these applications are generating, because that data is business critical. I know I kind of made this point a couple of minutes ago, but these applications are generating important information that does need to be recoverable in the event that something happens. It's also not going to be sort of, it's not going to be able to provide, protection against some of these ransomware and other cyber attacks that we're seeing as well. So it's important to have some more robust data protection, true backup and recovery, for example, for these applications. Another kind of important point to make too is that the service provider in this instance is not, in terms of the service provider for the SaaS application, they're responsible for making sure that that application is available to you, but they are not actually responsible for the data protection at the end of the day. It is still responsibility of the customer to protect the data. So that's just sort of one more reason why these applications really do sort of require that protection. And again, backup as a service is likely to be a good fit there. So we've talked a lot about some of the market dynamics and taxonomies and things like that. And the last thing that I'd sort of like to leave you with is a number of key questions that we've identified that we view as sort of important to keep in mind for customers as they're evaluating different backup as a service solutions. I've actually kind of identified 10 of them that I'm going to walk through and kind of give a little bit more color on. So the first question is around flexibility of deployment. So do you have the option to have the more self-service or the more fully managed model? Can this backup offering be hosted on-prem or in the cloud? And I think that having that flexibility is very important because one size doesn't fit all. One approach is not going to be right for all customers. So in my opinion, it's important for the service provider to have some flexibility to be able to meet those different requirements that customers are going to have. The second question is looking at, okay, backup and operational recovery, disaster recovery, failover, things like that, and also tiering and long-term retention. Can the backup as a service offering address these three use cases? As we talked about a few minutes ago, customers are going to require both kind of backup and recovery and disaster recovery, depending on their different workload requirements. And, customers are going to have, obviously, compliance and data retention requirements. So if the backup as a service offering can address these, it's going to make the customer's life easier because they're not going to have to worry about having different solutions for these different use cases, and they're going to have all their bases covered, so to speak. The third question is around automation, and is there automated execution for backup jobs and for recovery jobs? So this is going to, again, make the customer's life easier if the backup jobs are automated, kind of gives peace of mind that things are being protected as they need to. And then from a recovery standpoint, this can be important in reducing the recovery time and getting things up and running again more quickly, the more that things can be automated. The fourth question is thinking about kind of automation, but also thinking about sort of policies in these backup jobs and sort of what choice does the customer have over policies for things like backup frequency and for things like data retention. Are they allowed to sort of customize those depending on what they need, or is it sort of t-shirt size, small, medium, large, and they have to sort of pick one and go with it? Obviously we see that the more flexibility that the service provider can offer from that perspective ends up being certainly much more valuable for the customer. The fifth question is, if this offering is managed, what level of transparency is there to see how exactly the service provider is managing the data and the backups? And can the customer take control if needed? So it's important to have a strong relationship and to have trust, in your service provider, but also it's important to have that transparency and communication and visibility too, because the customer is going to be the one responsible at the end of the day for making sure that the data is recoverable and making sure that compliance requirements are being made, for example. The sixth question we've identified is public cloud support. Can the public cloud be leveraged for backup copy storage, for failover, for DR testing, for long-term retention, for example? This is kind of an important use case for the public cloud, and having that option, I think is important for customers, because this can, it can really make sense in a number of cases. Questions 7 and 8 kind of go hand in hand a little bit. Question 7 is, are containers and cloud native applications supported? And question number 8 is sort of the range of the core data center, the edge, and the cloud supported. And these two questions really sort of just go to making sure that all these sources that require protection are supported, and that the solution is going to be comprehensive enough to address those. On a similar kind of topic, question 9 is there a dashboard for centralized insights and visibility into the environments being protected? So I have one dashboard, to sort of oversee my protection jobs, my data environment, and maybe, for example, to get some analytics into, kind of things like cyber threats and security and things like that. That all can be really valuable for customers. And the last question is, can the offering allow for the shift to more of a variable consumption-based pricing model? We've kind of touched on that. A lot of legacy solutions do not offer that, and it really can be a draw for backup as a service. So we've touched on quite a bit in this session, and hopefully you're walking away with a better understanding of the backup as a service market, how it breaks down, what types of services are available, when it might make sense, and if it might make sense for you, and also hopefully gave you some thoughts on some key questions to ask as you're evaluating solutions. Please, we certainly want to hear any questions, any feedback. We really want this to be valuable for you, and we want to be a resource for you. So please reach out to Predatar, please reach out to Evaluator Group with any questions or comments. We'd love to have a conversation. And with that, thank you very much for joining this session. I really appreciate your time today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Predatar Control. Thanks so much.